morning, everyone. This is Michelle Bach, and thank you for joining our Safety Council meeting this morning. It is great to be with everyone virtually. I just heard some interesting news on the way into work. Maybe you folks are already aware of this, but I just heard that the governor has apparently lifted all health orders as of June 2nd. So I personally can't wait to hear if or when the BWC and the Industrial Commission are going to reopen. So that was my big excitement this morning, but thank you for joining us. But I have no other announcements, so I will just turn it over to Craig for the BWC update.
Well, thanks, everybody. I appreciate you guys welcoming me. It's kind of good to talk to you again. In May, we have an awful lot of information coming out of OSHA about fall protection. May is a fall protection month. They hold a stand down every year, but there's still an awful lot of information from the OSHA website about fall. So if that's something that concerns you, this is certainly a month to pay some extra attention and kind of focus on that. If you may have heard about some of this, there's still an awful lot of push toward vaccinations. We're working with businesses to offer different clinics and different kinds of locations. But if you want more information from the Department of Health about how to get connected to these vaccination sites that could be set up in employers' locations, please get in touch with the ODH because they're out there to help. NIOSH and the CDC have put together this instrument that helps you determine worker well-being. People have, at different rates, developed some issues with being isolated, being away from friends, being away from family, Zooming meetings all the time. And it's probably a good idea to occasionally just talk to them. If you want to get a little more information, you want a little more specific information about how they're doing, this instrument can help to establish what their experience is, what their work evaluations are, and a variety of other things. So that's out there. It's free to use. CDC's published a new webpage about germicidal irradiation using ultraviolet radiation to kill the COVID virus. So that may be something, if you're looking at ways to improve your indoor air quality, the Bureau does have an assistance program for that. Feel free to contact us. Don't let stress build up. If you see people, if you hear people seem to be acting highly stressed, a lot of problems, maybe with the governor's announcements last night, that stress can build, especially as we start to see the light at the end of the tunnel, as we start to see that there really is a way out of this. And finally, I'll finish up with tips from the American Academy of Ophthalmology to help ease eye strain. If you spend all day sitting in front of a computer, as a lot of us do, because that's how we connect, you might want to look at how you can make your eyes feel a little less exhausted, a little less tired at the end of the day, and maybe you feel a bit better too as a result. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Michelle. Thank you guys very much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Craig. Appreciate that update. And I will just go ahead and introduce our speaker, Pat Clark. She has retired from over 30 years in public education, having served primarily as a high school counselor, but not content with retiring. She went on to serve as a prevention specialist for the abuse and rape crisis shelter of Warren County. And she has also worked with schools facilitating an anti-bullying program. She then went on to work under a federal grant to conduct training with respect to youth mental health first aid, trauma, and resilience. And not content to let her training lapse after the grant ended, she opened her own consulting business to continue her passion of educating individuals around mental health issues. She also serves as a consultant to Prevention First, conducting numerous webinars. She is passionate about her work with youth, and she remains very active in Warren County as a member of multiple coalitions. And she is going to talk to us today about understanding trauma. So we welcome Pat and appreciate her coming to speak today.
Thank you. Just wanted to share with you the information that I will be speaking about today comes to you from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, the Ohio Mental Health Services Administration, and Akron's Children's Hospital. So these are all institutions that do a lot surrounding trauma. I am by no means an expert in trauma. There are lots of experts out there, however, but I do think that I can give you a pretty good explanation of trauma and its importance in terms of understanding it. Some of the things that we'll be talking about today sometimes can be sensitive in nature. So for individuals who may have experienced trauma, sometimes this can bring about some trauma reminders. So I just wanted to let you know that. Why? Why should we understand trauma? Well, let's think about it right now from the standpoint of where we are. We are in the middle of a worldwide traumatic event, certainly the pandemic. And I think sometimes if we can get a basic understanding of how trauma can affect each of us individually, it can give us an understanding of behavior that we may see coming from someone. Whether it's an employee, whether it's a spouse, whether it's a parent, a child. Having a basic understanding can really help to explain just human behavior. So I'm going to try and give you a brief understanding of trauma today, explain a little bit about what it is, how it can occur, and hopefully that will help you understand other individuals when maybe you see some behavior that you're questioning as to why are they acting that way. So in my former life, as they were saying, I was a high school guidance counselor. And our students started school every morning at 7:20 in the morning. So it was nice and early. Well, I happen to be a morning person, so I would usually get to work by about 6 a.m. so I could kind of get myself started for the day. Well, on my way to work every morning, I drove through McDonald's. And I picked up a nice hot piping cup of coffee. And so this was my ritual every morning. So this is very early in the morning. Well, I picked up my cup of coffee one day and I'm coming out of the McDonald's parking lot. And it just so happens there's a street light where I turn onto the road to go to work. And it's a very busy street there coming out of McDonald's. But, you know, it's before 6 o'clock in the morning and there's not too many people on the road. Well, the light happened to be red. And the person in front of me was stopped. They were also turning right. You can turn right on red, right? And I'm sitting there and they're not turning. And I'm like, would you turn? Would you turn? All of a sudden I'm like, would you just turn? And the light turned green and the person turned. And all of a sudden I started laughing at myself. I'm like, what the heck's the matter with you? What, 5-10 seconds out of your life? You can't spare that? This is ridiculous. I mean, I just literally went off. Well, it wasn't until I got to work that I realized I wasn't reacting to this person not turning right on red. What I was really reacting to was the fact that I was going into work that morning and I was going to be meeting with a very contentious parent. It just happened to be one of those parents that no matter what I did, I couldn't do right by their child. And I realized that that's where my reaction was coming from. I was having a stress reaction that was really to the meeting that I had coming up, had nothing to do with my cup of coffee and that traffic light. And we have lots of stressors in our lives, right? We have financial stressors. You know, we have stressors around time, either time constraints, too much time, too little time, never enough time. It might be around our children. Could be around our job. You know, do we have the job that we really want, or do we want something else? Or maybe right now, right? It's around the pandemic and what we're facing. Well, if we really want to understand trauma, we have to understand stress. Because stress is a big part of trauma. So if we look at stress, it really goes along a continuum. So you see here on the graphic, we've got some little balloons. The balloon there on the left-hand side, you know, the white balloon, we got a nice little smiley face. Right there, we're at a stress level of maybe 1 or 2. Next to that, we're probably 3, 4, then 5, 6, 7, 8, then we're at 9, 10. And we can go from 1, 2 to 9, 10 in nothing flat, right? That's exactly what happened when I was sitting at that stoplight. I was perfectly content. I was happy. I had my cup of coffee. And all of a sudden, I moved to that 9, 10 level. And sometimes we never even know what's going to trigger that response that we have to the stress. So if we look back at what we call our stress response system, we really have to go back to caveman days. So it's a basic response that all of us have. It's been there forever. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Okay, in our stress response system, what will happen is all of a sudden we will sense some kind of danger or something that puts us on high alert, kind of like a policeman blowing a whistle. Hey, hey, pay attention. So let's say in that caveman day, I'm a caveman and I'm walking along. I happen to have a club with me, which is nice. I'm looking for food. And all of a sudden, I see a saber-toothed tiger. Okay, that's going to put me on high alert. When that happens, my body releases all of these different chemicals. It has a biochemical reaction. So there's actually 1,600 different chemicals that start moving around in my body when this happens. And at that time, I make a split-second decision. And my decision is, am I going to fight that danger? So if I'm the caveman, am I going to take my club and go after the saber-toothed tiger? Am I going to flee from that danger or take flight? So I'm the caveman, I'm running away. Or maybe what happens is I just freeze. I just totally stop in my tracks and don't know what to do. Once that danger, though, subsides, and once I make some type of action, what happens is I go back to what we call homeostasis. So all of those chemicals that were racing around in my body, all of a sudden they all even out again, and they go back to where they need to be. So thinking about this kind of modern day, let's say you're driving your car, and all of a sudden a car pulls out in front of you. You know, you make a split-second decision. You know, do I kind of fight it by putting on my brakes, right? Maybe I kind of try and flee it by pulling my car to the side. Or maybe I just freeze altogether, and who knows, do I run into that car, or am I lucky and it gets by me? But if you think about that, because most of us, I think, have had something like that happen if we're driving, kind of a near miss, think about how you felt during that. And how you experience that. I know for myself when that's happened and I slam on my brake, the next thing I know my leg is shaking and my body's shaking. But eventually I get back to what we call that homeostasis. Now for individuals that are in traumatic experiences, especially if it's ongoing trauma that it's occurring all the time, they have a very difficult time getting that stress response system to go back to that homeostasis state. So they're always, oftentimes, on high alert. And there's also something that we call the brain-gut connection. And it involves what we call the vagus nerve. So if you look at the slide here, you see there's all these nerves kind of like in the stomach area, also to the lungs and to the heart. And that comes from back in our brain stem, the very back of our brain, kind of a primitive area. And if you've ever had somebody say to you when you ask them, well, why didn't you do that? Or What happened? And you go, I don't know, it was just a gut reaction. It didn't feel right. We always say, go with your gut. That's our primitive system telling us to be aware, be on alert. And to give you another idea of how that works, if you look at this picture here, I'm assuming you're all smiling, right? And think about that, and then let's put in that laughter that comes with it. That's one of those gut reactions that we have. So that's kind of that vagus nerve, and we call it a vagus nerve that comes from that brainstem, but it's really nerves. But it kind of goes directly to that area. So that's another way that we have that reaction. But if you've ever had that gut level reaction that tells you, maybe I shouldn't do this, don't do it. So there are different types of stress. There's positive stress. And we all need some level of stress in our lives. Positive stress would be maybe you're looking forward to a date. You're looking forward to going on vacation. You're looking forward to graduation, like this time of year. So there's a level of stress, but it's positive. Then we have what we call tolerable stress. And tolerable stress is going to be at a little bit higher level. Maybe it's taking an exam or taking a test. Maybe it's a job interview. But it's a level of stress you can tolerate because you know it's not going to last for a long time. Could be moving to a new home or moving to a new job. So all of that would be what we call tolerable stress. But then we get to the next level, which is called traumatic or toxic stress. And this is where you have a really hard time turning off that stress response system. So this might be people who are living in poverty. It might be people who are living in a war zone. Right now, with what we've had kind of going on with the pandemic and the length of time that it's been going on, for some people that is also a toxic or a traumatically stressful event. So we all need stress to function, but when we're functioning at that traumatic or toxic level, it's really going to take a toll on us, and even a toll on our health, which we'll talk a little bit about later. So there are physical signs of stress. I think probably all of us have had these, and there's a variety of them. Each of us might react a little bit differently to the stress levels, right? Sometimes people go, injuries, why? Oops, let me go back to that. Why is injury on there, right? If you think about if you've ever been kind of stressed and all of a sudden you find yourself maybe running into things, having little accidents, oftentimes it's because we're not able to focus when we're really stressed. A lot of people will have aches and pains that they feel when they're stressed. If you ask a person, where do you carry your stress? Most people can tell you. I carry mine in my shoulders. I carry mine in my stomach. Most of us have a pretty good idea of where that might be. And then there's also what we call the emotional signs of stress. So being irritable, having angry outbursts, feeling depressed, feeling down, having a certain level of anxiety, maybe withdrawing from other individuals, could even be things such as nightmares, could be mental fatigue. So again, let's relate it back to the pandemic, right? Anybody here been irritable? I know I have, right? The littlest of things, especially at the very beginning when we had no idea what we were dealing with, I would go off and I couldn't understand why. Well, I had all these other concerns. And so the slightest thing would send me off. Mental fatigue, you walk into a room and it's like, why am I here? I know I came in here for something, but I don't know what it was. All of these things can be signs of emotional signs of stress. So if we want to understand trauma, there's a way I like to frame it, and this comes from, again, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And it's what I call the 3 E's of trauma. So what is trauma? We'll walk through the 3 E's. But individual trauma is going to result in an event, our first E, or series of events or circumstances that we experience, our second E, that can be life-threatening. It poses a danger to us. And it has lasting adverse effects, our 3E, our third E. And that can be either our physical health, our emotional health, socially. It may be spiritually damaging to us. So let's take a closer look at each of these E's individually. So that first E is the event. So it's really, what was the circumstance? What was it that actually happened that caused that trauma? And this is one of those things where what we really want people to do is we want you to shift your thinking. And instead of asking, what's wrong with you? When we see a behavior that's difficult to explain, or when somebody really explodes, we really want to ask the question, what happened to you? If we ask the question, what's wrong with you? Number one, we're assuming the person had control over the event. So we don't want to place that blame on them. What we really want to know is, what happened to you that caused this reaction? So what was it that actually occurred? Our second E is the experience. So this is where we say the circumstance of that event, and the amount or the dosage of that event is going to matter. And when we're looking at that, we're really looking at when did it happen? So for example, at what period in our life did it happen? How did it happen? Where did it happen? Was it at home? Was it at work? Where? And how often did it happen? Was it just a one-time occurrence, or did it go on for a period of time? And so there's a couple of different ways that we can be exposed to trauma. The first one is through what we call direct exposure. So this is where it actually happened to us, right? So we actually were the victim or the target of the trauma. The other way is to witness the event. So maybe it's something that we saw occur. Maybe we saw someone get killed. Maybe we saw something happen. Maybe we saw an accident happen. So we witnessed that event. So for example, years ago there was a hurricane on the East Coast. It was Hurricane Sandy. And some parents happened to leave the television on so they could see what was happening with Hurricane Sandy, and it was on all the time. And they didn't live where it happened, but it happened to be on the news constantly. And their son was watching TV, and he kept seeing this going on and on and on. Eventually, he became afraid to go out of the house, didn't want to leave his parents, because he thought that this was happening all over, and that this was going to happen there as well. So he became fearful of leaving his parents' side and fearful that it was going to happen there. So sometimes, even with younger children especially, just seeing these things over and over again can have a traumatic event experience for them. And then the other would be a trauma happening to a loved one. So somebody that's really close to us, we know what happened to them. Sometimes that can be another way that we're exposed to it. And there's different types of trauma. There's what we call acute trauma, which it's kind of like a one-time occurrence. So maybe it's a car accident, or maybe it's a robbery. We have what we call chronic trauma, which is ongoing trauma. That could be something like poverty, again, a war zone. It could be abuse. And then we have traumatic grief. And this would be something we would experience after a loved one died. It could be a death. It could be maybe a divorce. If a parent is serving in the armed forces and one parent has to go overseas for a young person, that could be a traumatic event. It could even be the loss of a pet. If there was a really close relationship with that pet and it served like an emotional support. And then there's what we call complex trauma. And complex trauma is kind of that layering effect of trauma, of that chronic trauma. So maybe I'm living in poverty, maybe I'm experiencing abuse, it's ongoing. Or maybe I'm in a war zone and it's ongoing. So these would be the different types of trauma that someone may experience. And then we have our third E in trauma, and that's the actual effect of the trauma. So again, that's going to be a lasting, long-term effect that it's going to have on our physical, our social, our emotional, or our spiritual consequences. And when we look at the effect, what we really need to understand is that the effect that that individual feels from that trauma really is a normal response. What's not normal is the event itself. So like for those of us who are irritable from the pandemic, you know, that's a normal response, right? That's a normal response. What's not normal is the pandemic. So the response that an individual has, though, to a traumatic event is really normal. It's, again, that event that isn't normal. So I'm going to talk to you and give you an idea about, you know, how this could impact someone. So I'm going to go back a few slides here. And I'm going to talk to you about a time that I had a traumatic event. Okay, so I was 10 years old, and I was playing in a neighbor's yard, and there were several of us there. And it came time to go home, and so I go running out of the yard. Well, what I didn't know is that in the time we went into the backyard to the time I was leaving the backyard, the neighbors had let their dog out. So as I'm running out of the backyard, suddenly I get bit by the dog. Okay? So the when is I was 10 years old. How did it happen? I got bit by a dog. Where did it happen? It happened in our neighborhood. It also was my left butt cheek. And then how often did it happen? It was a one-time occurrence. So what was the result, though, of this incident? Well, I grew up in Detroit, and we had city blocks. So when I would be coming home from school and walking home, if I saw a dog down the street, I'd move a city block over. If I saw another dog down that street, I'd move another block over. So I would do anything I could to avoid seeing a dog on my way home from school. I became fearful of dogs, which I never was before. If I was going with my parents to visit someone, I would always ask if they had a dog in the house because I didn't want to be in there. If my friends had a dog, I didn't want to go to their house. So it had an effect on me. That event had an effect on me. However, I'm going to call this a small t trauma. Why? Because eventually I was able to get over those effects, right? I was able to move through that. That was something I was able to get over. But at the time, right, it affected my life and it affected what I was doing. So fast forward, I'm now 14 years old. And my brother, who is 17 and in his second semester of high school, dies suddenly. He got sick, went into the hospital, was there 2 days, and passed away. Right? So when did it happen? I'm 14. How did it happen? It was a death. Where did it happen? I would call it a family event. So it happened with mom, dad, myself. Okay? How often? Obviously, a single time event. The effects, however, lifelong, right? Lifelong. For my parents, how do you ever get over that? Now, death, sometimes we can accept it, and it's not traumatic. It may be a natural course. But when we have a death that occurs, in this instance, to a otherwise perfectly healthy young man, it becomes that big T trauma, a traumatic event. And again, carrying lifelong effects. Certainly affect me in terms of, I didn't want to leave home because I was afraid if my brother could die, my mom and dad could die, right? That didn't keep me in the house. I still went out, but I didn't spend as much time with friends. Spiritual consequences, right? Starting to question, in my case, God. And it affected relationships, even as I've gone through life. So these types of events can have long-lasting adverse effects. And again, when I look at those reactions that I had in both of those situations, they were normal reactions, right? They were normal reactions. What was abnormal were the events that occurred. So some things that might be traumatic events, all of these things have the potential to be traumatic events. Now, again, let's think about the pandemic, right? For some of us, we may think of it as a bump in the road. For others, depending on what happened through it, it may have those lifelong adverse effects. Thinking about poverty, right? If I'm living in poverty all of the time, I'm worried about, am I going to have a roof over my head? Where's my next meal coming from? Let's go back to that stress response system. I am going to be stressed. I'm going to be stressed, so I'm going to have a difficult time. So physical symptoms of trauma, they're going to be very similar to those symptoms of stress that we talked about. Those knots in the stomach, maybe headaches, fatigue. All of those things, again, similar in stress, same thing in trauma. Also, there's an impact, however, on our cognitive functioning, right? On our ability to kind of think. So maybe we don't have as good of an attention span. Our memory can be affected. Our focus can be affected. And even our IQ. What we find is individuals who are experiencing that toxic or traumatic stress, they can lose IQ points if it goes on for a long enough period of time. Remember I was saying that when my brother passed away, the first semester after he passed away, and I was a freshman in high school at the time, I failed 3 classes that first semester. Now, I'm not going to tell you I'm a stellar student. I was not a stellar student, right? But I didn't fail classes. I realized later, though, I was having a hard time concentrating because I was thinking again about all of these other things that were going on. And so school wasn't really on my mind. And sometimes, it has an impact on our emotions. A lot of times these are people who have a hard time doing what we call self-regulating. They lose their temper quickly. They're quick to startle. They have a hard time describing their feelings. If these were children that have experienced a lot of trauma, they might just say, happy, mad, sad, but they can't really express much more than that. And sometimes they have a hard time telling you what they want. So when we're talking about that cognitive function, oftentimes these will be individuals that will be diagnosed with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Or in the case of their impact on emotions, these might be young people who are diagnosed as ODD, oppositional defiant disorder. And what we find is in working with the juvenile justice system and looking at our juvenile detention centers, if we really take a look at some of those young people that are in there, oftentimes who come in with this diagnosis of ADHD or ODD, and we really start to look at them, what we're really dealing with is young people who have been impacted by trauma. So we really need to take a closer look. And socially, it can impact them. It can impact all of us. Might be we start to isolate from other people. Maybe you're very distrustful of others. Again, sometimes if we're always maltreated, if we're always abused as we're growing up, we come to expect that as being normal. And it's almost like, why are you treating me nice? That's not the expectation we have. And they can be young people who have difficulties establishing social boundaries. Either they become too attached to someone too quickly, or they have a very hard time attaching to someone. So I want you to think about a time or a place, a smell, a sound, a touch, something that makes you feel good. Okay, something that makes you feel good. You know, think about this with realtors, right? They always tell somebody if they're selling their home, bake bread. It smells good. People like that scent, right? I always think about when I was growing up, my dad always wore a cologne called gray flannel. And I love that scent, and I always associated it with my father. So whenever I would smell that, you know, and especially after my dad had passed away, it always gave me good feelings. You know, I always felt good. It's like, oh, that's so nice. It reminds me of my dad. Well, just as we have those things that will bring about really pleasant memories, especially if we have experienced trauma, we can have what we call trauma reminders. So let's say that we've had a big traumatic event in our past, and all of a sudden we get just the slightest reminder of that trauma. It can really bring about another full-blown big reaction, right? So let's think about right here, right? Let's think about Dayton with the tornado that came through. Right? So if I experienced that tornado and I was involved in that, don't you think maybe every time the sky gets dark and the wind starts to pick up and maybe there's a warning, I might very well have a big reaction to that. You know, again, a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. But we get those reminders, and all of a sudden, that will trigger that big reaction. Very normal, very normal. Let's say maybe I was a child, and I was at Grandma or Grandpa's, and they had a heart attack, and all of a sudden the ambulance came to take them to the hospital. So maybe I'm sitting in a classroom, and all of a sudden I hear a siren. And that event for me was traumatic. You may all of a sudden see a reaction out of me. So just as we can have those really pleasant things that trigger pleasant memories, we can also have things that will trigger those unpleasant memories where we might have a big reaction to it. You know, I talked about my dad wearing gray flannel, the cologne. So think about a person who is abused. Let's say a young woman who's sexually abused, and maybe that person wears a certain type of cologne. Whenever they smell that, they're going to have a big reaction to that. So again, you know, really human nature, but I think it kind of helps us understand what's going on. So really what I want you to think about is that with a lot of us, the behavior that we see is really just the tip of the iceberg. And certainly when it comes to reactions that we see to trauma, we're just seeing that little piece, and there's all those things going on underneath. And to give you an idea how this can impact us physically as well in our overall health, years ago there was a study done called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. It's called the ACEs study. And this was done a while ago. This was back between 1995 and 1997. And there were two doctors. Dr. Folletti, who was with Kaiser Permanente, had worked with patients who were obese. And he worked with them to get their weight down. Most of them went through gastric bypass surgery. And this was something they really wanted to do. And these were people, most of these people were white individuals, middle to upper class, who could afford this type of surgery, right? And what he found, as much as they wanted to lose that weight, afterwards, a large percentage of them still gained that weight back. So when he went back and delved further and started talking to these individuals, what he found is that eating response that they were having was really kind of a self-comforting, self-soothing. And when he looked deeper, though, there was trauma in their lives, unresolved trauma. So he got together with Dr. Anda from the Centers for Disease Control, and that was when they studied over 17,000 patients. And what they did is they asked them 10 questions, okay? And I'll put them up here for you to take a look at. 10 simple questions. But what these questions did is they got at whether or not these individuals had experienced some type of trauma in their life. Okay, these are the original 10 questions that I'm going to show you. They've kind of simplified them a little bit since then because the ACEs is still something that is used by a lot of doctors. But they've also modified it some because they realized it didn't get at everything. And the 10 questions really went to these three different areas: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. So under abuse, it was the physical, emotional, or sexual. Neglect was physical and emotional. And then we had household dysfunction. Okay, was somebody incarcerated? Was there mental illness? Was a mother maltreated or mistreated? Was there substance abuse? Was there any kind of divorce or separation? And what they found in asking those 17,000 individuals is that ACEs are common across all populations. And this is what they found since. That, again, that study happened to be with mostly individuals who were middle class and white that had health care. Because what they did in their study is when someone would go for a physical exam, they would also ask them those 10 questions. And they also found that almost 2/3 of the participants had at least one ACE. And more than 1 in 5 of those individuals reported 3 or more ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And we know that some populations are more vulnerable to ACEs, depending on social and economic status. That can sometimes come into play, but again, we still know they happen across the board. And we know that as the ACE score increased, the risk for physical maladies also increased. So a few interesting caveats in terms of the study. Again, it was conducted across what we would consider kind of a privileged population because everyone had health care. And the fact, though, that they occurred at such a high rate in that population really suggests that there are other populations, more disenfranchised populations, where ACE scores may even be higher. And second, that that list of the ACEs really, those 10 questions were not really exhaustive. So they are asking more questions these days. And again, we know that children in war zones, where individuals have experienced natural disasters, with food insecurity, right, and any other adverse experiences, again, can have long-lasting health outcomes. And so, again, these are the areas they found that really were affected in terms of the behavior and the physical and emotional pieces. So again, is that increase in ACE scores, we're going to see increase in health risks. Include up to and including perhaps premature death. So when we're dealing with when we're dealing with any type of trauma, the earlier that we can intervene, the better. The better the chances are of helping to mitigate what can be long-lasting adverse effects, and certainly long-lasting adverse effects on overall physical health, not just mental health, but physical health. And Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, if you get a chance, I would really encourage you. She's got some short videos out there on YouTube that talk about the ACEs study. But what happened recently is she's done a lot of studying on ACEs in populations, starting with, younger individuals, and kind of going through the lifespan. And so recently she was appointed the Surgeon General for the state of California, first Surgeon General they've had. And her goal is to get ACEs questionnaires out much earlier to populations. So use them for school screenings, to get doctors to use these screenings, so we can try and mitigate these circumstances where trauma may impact not only mental but physical health. And I want you to think about this. And Carl here, he and I were kind of just talking briefly about this, is that when you go into your doctor's office, they'll ask for a complete physical history, right? They'll ask about your parents, they'll ask about siblings. They'll ask for you to go back into your history of your physical health. But oftentimes they don't go back and ask these other questions about what other things may have impacted you. What about these mental health issues? We do see some questions asked these days about whether or not you're experiencing depression. Have you thought about suicide? But we don't see a lot of these other questions that really can impact your overall health. So again, in California, this is their goal of their Surgeon General, to start not only taking a look at our physical nature when we're in that physician's office, but also what are those other pieces of our life that may impact our mental health as well as our physical health. So in terms of trauma in children, these statistics are a little bit older, but 48% of children have experienced at least one or more of the 10 types of adverse effects. Children with histories of trauma are 2 times as likely to have chronic health conditions. Again, let's think about what we just talked about with ACEs. They're more likely to repeat a grade level, that cognitive impact that we talked about. And again, if they experience this trauma over a long enough period of time, can actually impact their IQ. So again, the reason I like to talk about trauma is because I know when I was a high school counselor, I didn't have a lot of this information. It would have really helped me. It would have helped me in dealing with a lot of the young people I worked with. I think it can help teachers, it can help counselors, it can help employers. It can help all of us to have a better understanding of behaviors that we see. So I'll leave you with this. The next time you see behaviors, and you can't understand why, I would ask that you take a closer look, take a moment and remember it's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you. And also remember, each of us will have our own response to a traumatic event. So I appreciate your being here today. I hope you were able to get some information out of this that you'll find useful across your life.